Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today, and it's going to be about jsdom.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, have you worked with jsdom a lot?
I have, yeah.
I think it's something that a lot of people who maybe haven't gotten into like really serious like web app development or anything, they hear jsdom, and it's kind of like, huh, what is that?
Yeah, it's one of those things that's kind of like a behind-the-scenes tool.
Right.
It's not something that like a regular user is going to interact with, but
Yeah.
for developers, it can be really, really useful.
So we've got some articles pulled up here. We've got some of your notes. It seems like jsdom is kind of this like, it's like a virtual browser, but it doesn't actually have a visual interface.
Right.
It's all happening like behind the scenes.
Yeah, so it's a pure JavaScript implementation of web standards.
Okay.
So like, how web pages are structured, there's the DOM and all that stuff. It understands all that.
Right.
But instead of like visually rendering it like Chrome or Firefox do, it lets you interact with it programmatically in Node.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's like having a web browser engine that's specifically for developers, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of cool.
And that's why it's become really popular for
Mm.
things like testing web applications
Okay.
and scraping data from websites and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Anywhere that you would need to work with web content in a Node environment, JSdom is kind of your tool for that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So can you give us like a really simple example of how we might actually use jsdom? Like say we have a basic HTML file, just like a paragraph of text in it or something. How will we like grab that text using jsdom?
Yeah, so first you would need to install JSdom using npm or yarn,
Mm-hmm.
and then you would require the JSdom module
Okay.
in your Node.js code,
Yeah.
and you create a new JSdom object,
Right.
and you pass in your HTML as a string.
Got it.
And then from there, you can access the document object, just like you would in the browser,
Okay.
and use all those familiar DOM methods like query selector
Okay.
to target elements and extract content and do all those kind of things that you're used to.
So it's almost like we're using the same like DOM manipulation techniques that we'd use if we were in a browser, but we're doing it all in Node?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's just scratching the surface.
Okay.
One of the things that makes JSDOM really powerful is how customizable it is.
Okay, tell me a little more about that, the customization aspect.
Sure. So like when you create a new JSDOM instance, you can pass in a bunch of options.
Right.
Like, for example, you can set the URL of the page,
Okay.
which is important for resolving relative links.
So if our HTML has images or links to other files in there, then setting the base URL helps JSDOM like know where to find those things.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
You can also control things like the referrer,
Okay.
which is, the URL that the page supposedly came from,
Mm-hmm.
and the content type,
Right. Right.
like whether it's HTML or XML.
Which I imagine are totally different.
Yeah, different parsing rules, different things like that.
Okay.
And then there's also a really handy setting called include node locations.
What is that one?
So that one will basically add location information
Okay.
to each of the nodes in the DOM so you can trace them back,
Oh,
like
okay.
where they are in the source code.
So if you're debugging something, you can kind of see like, oh, this element came from this specific line in my HTML file.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a breadcrumb trail back to your source code.
That's cool.
It can be a real lifesaver when you're working with, more complicated web pages or trying to figure out how your code is interacting with the DOM.
Yeah, that's awesome. Another setting that I saw in here is called storage quota.
Oh, yeah.
What does that one do?
That one lets you control how much data can be stored in local storage and session storage,
Okay.
just like in a real browser.
So we could actually like test like, hey, what happens if a user has filled up their storage in the browser? Does my app handle that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. You can simulate those situations and see how your app behaves, especially when it's reaching those limits.
Yeah, that's really neat.
And it's important for ensuring a good user experience,
Right.
You don't want to have things break just because someone has a lot of stuff stored in their browser.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good one, storage quota.
It is.
And then this is where it starts to get really interesting and I think maybe a little bit dangerous,
Yeah.
is that JSDOM can also execute JavaScript.
Yes.
But it's not like we have a browser sandbox.
Right.
So how do we like safely execute JavaScript in this environment?
So that's a really good question, and there are definitely some security implications to think about.
Yeah.
Because JSON Sandbox, it's not a perfect replica of a browser sandbox.
Right.
So you do always have to be a little bit careful, especially if you're dealing with like untrusted code or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So how do we balance that, like the power of wanting to be able to execute JavaScript, but also like keeping our systems secure?
Well, JSDOM gives you a couple of different options for how to handle that. One approach is to use the setting run scripts dangerously.
Oh, that sounds scary already.
Yeah, it's kind of as it sounds.
Okay.
Basically, what that does is it allows jsdom to execute any scripts that are in the HTML that you provide.
So it's just going to run whatever it finds.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, and that seems like it could be a little risky.
Yeah, there's definitely some risk there because you're basically giving the script, the keys to your Node.js environment.
Right, like it can do whatever it wants.
Pretty much.
Okay.
So you really only want to use that if you completely trust the code.
Right, yeah, if you wrote it yourself or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what if we don't necessarily trust the code or if we just want to be a little bit safer about it?
Yeah, so the safer alternative is to use run scripts outside only.
Okay.
And what that does is it lets you execute scripts using window.evil.
Okay.
So you're basically creating like a separate little JavaScript world inside your JS and environment.
So it's like it still has access to the DOM and all that, but it's not like it can break out of that and mess with like my entire node setup or anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Ah,
It's all
yes.
about creating those layers of protection,
Right, right.
kind of isolating things.
Mm.
And I think in general, when you're working with jsdom, it's a good idea to just treat it like a real browser as much as possible
Okay.
and run your scripts within that context because it's just going to be more predictable and you're going to avoid those security headaches that
Yeah,
way.
gotcha. So that's good advice. Like when in doubt, are on the side of caution.
Always, yeah.
Okay. Something else that I thought was kind of interesting that we saw is this idea of like jsdom pretending to be a visual browser.
Hi.
But we've established that jsdom doesn't actually render anything visually. So
Right.
what is that all about?
So it's kind of a clever trick.
Okay.
So they pretend to be visual option. What it does is it makes jsdom act like it's a browser that has a visual window,
Okay.
even though it's still running headlessly, in your terminal.
Right, right.
And the reason that's useful is because some websites and applications use APIs like document.hidden
Right.
or document.visibility-state to detect whether they're actually being displayed to a user or not.
So even though jsdom can't show us the web page, it can like trick the code into thinking that it's being seen.
Exactly.
Okay, and that can affect how things run.
Yeah, and that can be really helpful for testing, certain scenarios that rely on those visibility states.
Yeah, I imagine so.
Like, for example, if you have a feature that only activates when the user is actually looking at the page,
Right, right.
you can use pretend to be visual to test that feature without actually needing a visual browser.
Okay, that's really neat.
Yeah.
So kind of along those same lines, how does jsdom handle like all those external resources that a web page often needs, like images, style sheets, JavaScript files?
Right. So by default, jsdom doesn't actually load those sub-resources.
Okay.
And that's for a couple of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One is security,
Okay.
and the other is performance.
Right.
It's just assuming that you want to work with the initial HTML that you provide.
Okay. But what if we do need to like test something that depends on those things? Like maybe our script needs to load data from an API.
Right. So you do have the option to enable sub-resource loading.
Okay.
And you do that by using the resources usable setting.
Got it.
And that tells jsdom to fetch and process resources like iframes,
Okay.
style sheets,
Right.
and external scripts, as long as you also have script execution enabled as well.
Okay.
So you need both of those settings turned on.
So that would be like if we're testing like how our website interacts with third-party libraries or APIs or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So that makes sense. But is there a way to have like even finer control over that? Like what if we want to like mock a specific API response or something?
Yeah, you're thinking like a power user.
That's what I try
So
to do.
for those who need that granular level of control,
Mhm.
jsdom provides a really cool class called Resource Loader.
Okay.
And that allows you to create a custom resource loader.
Oh, wow.
And you can completely override how resources are fetched.
Okay. I feel like this is getting into some advanced territory now.
Yeah, it is a bit more advanced, but it's really powerful.
Okay, can you give me an example of like what we might use a custom resource loader for?
Sure. So let's say you're testing a form submission on your website,
Okay.
and that form, sends data to an external API.
Right.
With a custom resource loader, you could intercept that API call,
Mm-hmm.
and instead of actually hitting the real server,
Right.
you could just return like a predefined response.
Oh, so you're like mocking the API.
Exactly. You're mocking the API interaction
And that's cool.
without actually having to, deal with the real server.
So it gives you a lot more control over your testing environment.
Yeah, a lot more control.
That's awesome. Okay. And then I think one more thing that we wanted to touch on was these virtual consoles that we kind of mentioned earlier.
Oh, right.
So how do those work in jsdom?
So virtual consoles in jsdom, they're basically like the developer console
Mm-hmm.
that you would find in a web browser.
Right.
where you see all the console messages and all that. So to
Yeah.
capture all those console.logs and
Right. So,
console errors and all those kind of things.
so like if I have some JavaScript in my web page and it's like console.logging something, I can actually see that in my node environment.
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool.
You can see all those messages.
Okay.
And you can even take it a step further. You can create custom listeners for specific events.
Oh.
So like, error, warn, info, and so on.
So we can like actually respond to those events if we want to.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can programmatically react to different console messages and build like sophisticated logging and debugging workflows right into your Node.js code.
Oh, wow.
It's really powerful.
So it's like having a direct line of communication with the code that's running inside of jsdom.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's awesome. Okay. And there's also a special event, right, for like catching errors from jsdom itself?
Yes, there is. It's called jsdom error.
Okay.
And that will fire whenever jsdom encounters an error, whether it's like a problem loading a sub-resource or a script execution error that isn't caught by the page itself.
Okay.
It gives you some valuable insights into what's happening behind the scenes.
So that can be really useful for debugging.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so that's cool. And one more thing I wanted to ask about, what about cookies?
Oh, yeah.
Do those play a role in this jsdom world?
Yeah, absolutely. JSDOM has built-in support for cookies, just like a real browser.
Okay.
It uses what's called a cookie jar to store and manage those cookies.
Right.
And they actually influence how sub-resources are loaded as well.
So like if I'm testing a website that uses cookies for like authentication or something, I
Yeah.
can actually simulate that entire process.
You can. JSDOM will take care of cookie persistence.
Okay.
And, make sure that cookies are sent along with the appropriate requests and all that, just like you would expect in a real browser.
It's amazing. It seems like JSDom has thought of everything.
Yeah, they've really tried to cover all the bases.
Okay, before we move on, are there any other customization features that you think are worth mentioning?
Oh, yeah, there are a couple more things.
Oh, okay, cool. What else is there?
One that's really handy is called the before parse hook.
The before parse hook.
Yeah.
Okay, what is that one?
So that hook gives you the ability to customize the JSDOM environment before any of the HTML is even parsed.
Oh, wow. So it's like you setting the stage.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
Alright.
you're getting everything ready
Okay.
before the actual content is loaded.
Gotcha. So what would be like a good use case for something like that?
Well, one example would be like if you need to use any polyfills or shims,
Right.
those little bits of code that add missing functionality to older browsers.
Okay.
You could use the before parse hook to inject those polyfills into your JSDOM environment.
Oh, okay.
And that way you can make sure that everything's going to run smoothly, even if JSDOM doesn't natively support those features.
Okay, so it's kind of like we're prepping the environment
Right.
to make sure everything's compatible
It's
before
standard.
we even get started.
Yeah, it's like laying the groundwork
Gotcha.
for a smooth experience.
Okay, that's a good one before parse. I'll have to remember that one.
Yeah.
So what about the JSDOM object itself?
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the key properties and methods that we should know about?
So the window property, probably the most important one,
Okay.
that gives you access to the virtual window object, which is essentially like the heart of your
Right.
JSDOM environment.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you can interact with the DOM, execute scripts, access global variables, all those kind of things that you would normally do.
It's like the browser's JavaScript console, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Let's see, there's the serialize method,
Okay.
which is really useful. That one generates the HTML representation of your current document.
So if we've like scraped some data from a website and cleaned it up, rearranged some elements, we can use serialize to get the final HTML output.
Exactly. It's like taking a snapshot of the DOM
Okay, that makes sense.
after you've made any changes.
Cool. Any other noteworthy methods?
There's also the node location method.
Node location. Okay, what's that one?
So that one lets you trace back any DOM mode to its original location in the HTML source code.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of like that include node locations setting.
Yeah, so that setting actually has to be enabled for node location to work.
Okay.
But once it is, you can use this method to really kind of understand like
Right.
the relationship between your HTML source
Mm-hmm.
and the resulting DOM tree.
Okay, so one's like the setting that turns on the tracking and the other's the method that lets us actually follow the trail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good analogy.
Okay, cool. So we've talked about like creating a JSDOM instance and passing in like our HTML and all that.
Right.
Are there any like shortcuts or convenient ways to do that, like to get up and running quickly?
Yeah, there are actually a couple of factory methods
Okay.
that JDOM provides that can really simplify things.
Okay, what are those?
One of my favorites is called Merle.
For Merle. Okay.
So what that does is it fetches the HTML content from a given URL
Okay.
and then creates a JSDOM instance from it.
So we don't even have to like make the HTTP request ourselves or anything.
Yep, it does all that for you behind the scenes.
Okay, that's really handy.
Especially when you're working with web pages directly from the internet.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then there's also from file,
From file, okay.
which does the same thing,
Yeah.
but it loads the HTML from a local file.
So if we're testing with like static HTML or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Or if you already have the content stored locally,
Gotcha.
then you can use that.
That's handy. Any other cool ones?
Yeah, there's one called Fragment.
Fragment, okay.
So that one's useful when you just want to work with a fragment of HTML.
Okay.
Like you don't need a full JSDom instance. You just need to parse like a small chunk of HTML.
Right.
So it creates a document fragment
Okay.
from a string of HTML.
So it's kind of like a lightweight way
Exactly.
to do some DOM manipulation.
Yeah, it's a very focused,
Okay.
efficient way.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So beyond all these like core features, is there anything else that JSDom can do that's like worth knowing about?
Yeah, so JJSOM actually has some like more specialized capabilities.
Okay.
For example, if you're working with Canvas elements,
Right.
JSL integrates really well with the Canvas package.
Okay.
So that means you can actually use like Canvas drawing APIs
Oh, wow.
within your JSDOM environment.
So we could like test stuff that's like drawing charts or animations or something.
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool.
It also has built-in encoding sniffing,
Oh, cool.
just like a real browser.
What does that mean?
So it can automatically detect the encoding
Okay.
of the HTML content that you're working with.
So we don't have to like specify that every time?
Nope, it just figures it out for you.
That's handy.
Yeah, it takes care of all those like behind-the-scenes details.
Cool. Okay, so it sounds like JDOM has a lot going for it.
Yeah, it's a pretty awesome tool.
But I think it's also important to point out that it's not like a perfect solution.
Right, it does have some limitations.
Okay, what are some of the things that JSDOM like doesn't do so well or that we need to be aware of?
One of the main limitations is its handling of asynchronous script loading.
Okay.
So JSystem doesn't have a perfect way to know when all those scripts have finished loading,
Okay.
which can be a little bit tricky if you're testing code that relies on those scripts.
So if like our web page is loading like external JavaScript files asynchronously, we might need to come up with some workarounds to make sure that they've actually finished before our tests run.
Yeah, exactly. There are strategies that you could use, like polling for the presence of certain elements.
Okay.
Or using mechanisms provided by the script loaders themselves to signal completion.
Okay, that makes sense. Are there any other gotchas that we should know about?
Another one is that JSDOM doesn't fully implement every single web platform API.
Okay.
So while it covers like the vast majority of commonly used features, you might occasionally run into an API that's not supported.
Okay, and what do we do in those cases?
Well, if you're feeling adventurous, you could always contribute to the JSDOM project and help implement the missing functionality.
Yeah.
Or, depending on your specific needs, you might consider using another tool that has a more complete implementation of the web platform.
Okay, so it sounds like JSDOM is like a really awesome tool for a lot of things, but we always got to be aware of its boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. No tool is perfect for every situation.
Right.
But JSDOM is definitely incredibly versatile and powerful.
Awesome. Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've learned a ton about JSDOM.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Any like final thoughts or questions that we should leave our listeners with?
Sure. I mean, think about how you could use JSOM to build like a web scraper
Okay.
that extracts valuable data from your favorite websites.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe consider how you might incorporate JSOM into your testing workflow
Right.
to make sure that your web applications are working flawlessly across all different browsers.
Yeah, good stuff. All right. Well, to all our listeners out there, I would encourage you to go check out JSDOM, dig into the documentation a little bit more, and yeah, discover what this tool can do for you.
It's a really fun tool to play around with.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, this has been another awesome deep dive. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
And to all our listeners out there, until next time, keep on diving deep.